Welcome to this session on reading and literacy strategies for the NGRT, interactive decoding and comprehension activities to improve your students' reading and literacy outcomes. So my name is Emily Whitmore, and I'm an international consultant at GL Education. And today I'm going to talk to you about those follow-up activities you can do in the classroom to improve reading and literacy outcomes for your students. So for today, I'm going to operate on the assumption that those listening are already familiar with our NGRT and are using it in the classroom already. So I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the NGRT report features and data points, but more importantly, I'm going to discuss follow-up classroom strategies to improve reading and literacy. Because in my consultations with schools around the world, this is the big question I'm getting with the NGRT. Not so much, how do I understand these data points on the report, but, what can I do next? What can I do in the classroom to ensure that reading and literacy outcomes are improved for my students? So if we look at the NGRT reports and we just go over some of those data points, typically schools focus on the standard age score and the reading age. Just so we're clear, some of these points include that standard age score, which gives you an indication of a student's reading and literacy ability in comparison to other students of the same age. As well as the percentile ranking, which gives you that same information in a slightly different format. Again, letting you know how your students' reading and literacy can be compared to other students of the same age and where they fall within that range. We also have a more visual representation of these standard age scores, and this is shown through the average band, which is represented by that yellow. The average band runs from 89 to 111. And this is the expected range for a student of any given age, followed by a standard age score data point, which lets you know where the student's performance falls in relation to that average band. And also you get that reading age, which lets you know what a student's reading age is in comparison to other students of the same age. So of course, taking into account the student's chronological age, but then looking at, based on the standardization, where their reading ability falls, if it's more comparable to a student who's, say, 16 or 17 years of age, rather than their chronological age of, let's say, 14 or 15 years. Now, in my consultations with schools, I've noticed that a lot of schools focus on, as I said before, the standard age score and the reading age. And these are great data points to focus on, because again, it is giving you that indication of a student's reading and literacy ability and where it falls in comparison to other students of the same age. But one thing I want to focus on today, a crucial data point that's often missed, is the, I'm just going to move this out of the way, is the separate Stay9 scores for sentence completion and passage comprehension. Because it is here where you can see a possible discrepancy between two important processes that make up the function of reading, that being sentence completion or decoding and passage comprehension. Now let's see how this plays out with like a student example. So using the same report, let's see how we could improve reading and literacy outcomes for students. So again, really focusing on this Stay9 breakdown between sentence completion and passage comprehension. So here with this example, we have a hardworking, precocious student who is assumed to definitely get an A in English class because he always has in previous years, right? He's an avid reader, really interested in English, and always gets an A, and is assumed to do so again this year. Now, if we look at his NGRT report and we focus on the standard age score and his reading age, we would expect that, yeah, definitely that A is probably a given, right? Look at where he falls in relation to that average band or that expected range for his age group, and look at his reading age. Now, it's been cut off here, but this report was from a student who was 13 years of age. But what I really want to focus on is that Stay9 breakdown between sentence completion and passage comprehension. Now, the Stay9 scores run from 1 to 9, with 9 being the highest. And we can see that when it comes to decoding or sentence completion, the student's skill here is very secure. Now, the comprehension Stay9 at 7, in and of itself, is not a bad score, right? 7 is on the low end of high. However, when we look at the student's overall score, we would expect that comprehension to be a bit stronger. In fact, it's going to call into question that, definitely getting an A, because we all know this student. We've encountered these students before where they, typically get an A or do really well until suddenly, and sometimes inexplicably, they don't. And for this student, it could be because, despite being precocious and despite being a very able reader, and despite having that higher than average literacy ability, he does have a hidden area of concern. His comprehension is not quite as strong as his decoding. And if it hasn't affected him yet, it might eventually, and it might be this year. We know as students get older, and especially as they enter secondary school, critical analysis becomes very important. And if those comprehension skills aren't in place, we could see that maybe he will struggle with that critical analysis. And when we're talking about decoding and comprehension and these, stay-nine breakdowns of the two, it's really important to not only understand how decoding and comprehension work together to make up the process of reading, but also to understand how they are different and how they need to be treated slightly differently in the classroom. So, for example, we know that decoding is what we call a teachable skill. And that's because word recognition and decoding involves a narrow scope of knowledge. For example, learning your letters and then understanding the sounds that those letters make, and then eventually understanding how those letters and those sounds make up words, and then the processes involved with reading, or the decoding, that once acquired will lead to fast, accurate word recognition. So this is a skill. With comprehension, it's not quite the same. It's a complex of higher level mental processes that include thinking, reasoning, imagining, and interpreting. And the processes involved in comprehension are dependent on having specific knowledge in a content area. So this makes comprehension largely knowledge-based and not skills-based. So it needs to be tackled quite differently. And I'm sure you're asking, okay, well, how can I improve my students' comprehension if it's not skill-based, right? How can I kind of tap into that knowledge and help improve that outcome for my student? In order to do so, it's important to understand how the NGRT report works. Now, if you have a profile similar to the one I just showed, where the student is, possibly an above average student, or even an average reader with a lower comprehension, it's important to take a look at the analysis of passage comprehension responses and really see what types of comprehensions skills they've mastered, and which comprehension skills they need to work on. And in this table, it will let you know because it has that drill down for you. So for example, if we're just going to use this one here, this student had 7 opportunities with comprehension retrieval questions, which refers more to simple recall, like are they able to identify, the setting, the characters, what was going on. And we can see here that with 7 opportunities, the student also got all 7 questions correct. So it would be safe to assume that generally speaking, the student doesn't struggle with that recall aspect of comprehension. And as we go down, we can actually see where the potential area of concern is. It's inference and deduction. So understanding the intentions and the motivations of characters, kind of empathizing with characters of the situation. The student might be struggling with that a little bit more because there were 3 opportunities to answer questions related to that, and the student got all 3 questions wrong. So when you're looking at these profiles, these individual NGRT profiles, and you want to come up with something a bit more targeted to help with that reading intervention, I do have a few suggestions today that can help you. So let's start with comprehension first, just because the NGRT report does provide that very helpful breakdown of the different comprehension skills. Now, the activities that I'm going to share with you can be modified for all ages and abilities. I am going to draw upon my experience a little bit. Just for reference, I am a former IBDP literature teacher. My students were between 16 to 18 years of age, but all of the strategies that I'm sharing with you today, while I did use them in the classroom, they can be modified for all ages, including very young students as well. And also, just a reminder, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution to improving comprehension, but these activities can increase critical analysis skills. And in the long term, we will hopefully see that benefit play out, right? That we will see stronger comprehension skills long-term for our students. So if we get back to that passage comprehension response table, if we're noticing low scores here, for the retrieval and the simple inference section, or what I like to call the what and the who, which essentially means like, can the student identify setting, characters, and plot points? If you want to work on this skill, and to be honest, this is a skill that can always be improved upon, regardless of the student's comprehension ability. One strategy I really highly recommend is KWL charts, right? And just also keep in mind that these are not my strategies. I've not made these up. These are just things that are tried and tested and true for me. And I know that quite a few English teachers are using them as well. So with the KWL chart, what you're asking students to do is to organize their understanding in terms of what they already know, what they wonder about, and what they've learned at the end. So for example, if you're introducing a new novel or a poem, you might read a few lines or that first chapter, and then you ask students to create their own individual KWL chart. Or you could also have this up on the smartboard and do it interactively. It doesn't really matter. The idea, though, is that you're asking students, okay, now that we've read a few lines of the poem, or now that we've read that first chapter of the book, what do you already know? What do you think you already know about this topic? And this is a great way to start because it's very safe for students, right? You're allowing students to tap into what they know, which is essentially getting them in their comfort zone, right? You're not asking them to immediately step outside of that comfort zone and try to analyze something they don't fully understand yet. You're asking them, okay, what here already makes sense to you? And covertly, what you're also doing is you're gathering a bit of intel. You're getting an idea of what already makes sense to your cohort, right? And you might notice some trends there, right? That, okay, several students already know this about the setting, or they're already familiar with this concept. And that means that you can more meaningfully tailor your lessons as well. Maybe you thought you needed to focus on the setting and the location a bit more, but after looking at your students' KWL charts, you've realized, well, actually, they're quite familiar with that setting or that time period. Let's move on to something more relevant. And that's where you can really tap into their interests by looking at the second column, which is the wonder, right? What do you wonder about? What are you curious about? What are you interested in? And this is giving students the opportunity to tell you, again, rather discreetly, what they're interested in. And this can also help you tailor those lessons and make it more meaningful for your students. Finally, after you finish the novel, after you finish the poem, you can ask students, okay, now that we've read it, we've discussed it, we've analyzed it, what did you learn? Now, with these KWL charts, not only can they help you achieve like a baseline understanding of the text, the historical context, etc., it really just helps you monitor trends at the individual and cohort level. So as I said, you might be able to tailor your lessons more effectively because you'll start to see what students already know, and then you can confidently move on from that. And then you can really tap into what is interesting them. And then you can also see what they're understanding at the end and get a sense of maybe how long it took them to understand that, maybe what they're still not sure of, etc. And it's also just asking students in a very benign way just to think a little bit more critically about the text that they're reading. Now, if your students are struggling with either context comprehension or social, cultural, and historical traditions, or what I would call the where and the when, which is essentially asking, does the student identify setting and understand its significance? A strategy I recommend to really help students kind of step into the time period or really, tune into the historical era of the text is an activity called rotating stations. Now, rotating stations are great because they're quite interactive. They can be, again, modified for any age group. And really what you're doing is you're finding interesting ways to acquaint students with the setting, with the time period, with the culture, with the country, and just letting them kind of ease into that transition. Because as we know as English teachers, that can be one of the big barriers when we start a new text, is that students might not be overly familiar with the time period or the country, and they might miss crucial information because we all know that setting and that time period can have a profound effect on the characters and what motivates them, why they say the things they say, etc. So when starting a new text, you can create these rotating stations. So the worksheet can look something like this. Typically, I would have no more than 6 stations in total. And what you can do is you set up these different stations around the classroom. Maybe students have about 10 or 15 minutes per station. You can organize them in whatever groups make sense for your classroom, either having students pick their group or you assign the groups, again, depending on your class. And you have students move from station to station to complete the tasks. So the task can provide background information before beginning a new text. It can focus on key events, character motives, literary devices, or whatever important aspect you want students to focus on. I typically used it specifically for context. Now, for example, when I taught my students The Great Gatsby, I was aware that students were not as familiar with the Roaring Twenties in the United States as much as I thought they would be. So I would use these rotating stations to get them acquainted with that era and really show them just the importance of that time period and what it meant socially, culturally, historically, etc. So for example, this is station 2, disillusionment and the lost generation. So at this station, students in their groups, they'd have about 10 or 15 minutes, and I've got the instructions here. So they look up the definition of disillusionment and they read the lost generation. I've got the link here for them. My students were a bit older, so they had laptops with them that they could take around to the stations and use. Again, you can modify this if you have younger students or students who are not using laptops. And then I have a couple of prompt questions here just to get them thinking a little bit more critically about this concept of disillusionment and what that might mean for the Roaring Twenties. In station 3, I had them read articles such as A Great Time to Be Rich, A Good Time to Be Middle Class, and Rural America Left Behind by Modernity. I'm also asking them to summarize the differences in lifestyles for the rich, the middle class, and farmers. One of the stations, I asked them to watch a YouTube video on flappers and just get them kind of, maybe seeing that style of dance and that costume. Again, just really acquainting them to the era. And it's quite a fun activity for students, and I found that it did get them excited about reading the text. For inference and deduction, and I will say that this is a common one that students struggle with, which can be described as that why. So it's asking, does the student understand the intentions and motivations of characters? Do they understand why something happened or what could happen? With any kind of struggle with inference, one strategy I recommend is something I called microscope. And this really just involves placing excerpts under the microscope for further analysis and investigation. I found it was a really excellent tool for examining character motives and intentions, discussing the significance of literary devices, and also focusing on key sections of the text. So let's look at that in practice. So for example, when my students were studying Julius Caesar, which is very concerned with the characterization of several characters, anytime a key monologue or soliloquy came along, I would essentially stop. We did a lot of the reading in class, and then after we read that key monologue or soliloquy that I wanted to focus on, we would stop as a class and we would examine it in more detail. So this would be after we just read the monologue by Cassius. It's now up on the smartboard. Here I've got the monologue again, and as a class, we're going to go through it, line by line. I've got some writing prompts here just for students to engage a bit more with the monologue. And the questions are very intentional, getting them to think about, what's going on here? What is Cassius thinking about? What's he saying to Brutus? What are his intentions here? What do you think he's trying to do? And then even with extension discussions, asking them kind of to empathize with Cassius. And can you relate? Can you step into his shoes? Are you good at convincing people? Have you ever tried to convince a friend or family member of their own greatness? Just really kind of getting students used to this idea of empathizing, of thinking about what they would do in that situation, and then just having that become the norm in the classroom, right? To really pause and to consider, the characters and what they're doing rather than bulldozing through the text. I would do this even before a text started. So for example, before we began reading The Talented Mr. Ripley, I would ask questions just to get them kind of hooked on the concept of the text. Ask them questions like, is there ever a good reason to forge your credentials? Yes or no? Let's have a little bit of a debate. Yes, we can all agree that forging your credentials is not a good thing to do, but is there ever maybe a good reason to do it? So we would discuss that a little bit more. And then even once we started reading The Talented Mr. Ripley, I would provide a quick write at the beginning of the class. And typically the quick writes were concerned with that characterization, something the character said or did, and often asking students, what do you think? Would you have done something similar? What if that happened to you? How would you react to the situation? Again, just getting them to think a little bit more about empathizing and understanding characters. Now, for the last bit here, and I've kind of lumped these three together, writer's purposes and viewpoints, writer's use of language, and organization of texts. just because it's mostly concerned with the why and the how, like, and asking, does the student understand the writer's message and how it's communicated? A strategy I recommend is something called backwards analysis. Now, I did a lot of backwards analysis in my class because I noticed that by the time my students, entered my classroom, and again, these were older students, 16, 17 years of age, who kind of already gone through primary school and most of secondary school, I was finding that a lot of my students, despite their interest in literature, were not fully confident in terms of their understanding of metaphors, similes, personification, those literacy devices, and also why the writer might be using those devices. So what I started doing is something called backwards analysis, where instead of asking students to identify where the literary device is, like, for example, we all know that exercise, right? Where the poem, you pass it the poem to the students and say, okay, find an example of metaphor or find an example of simile or personification. Instead, what I started doing was putting the poem or the excerpt from the text on the smartboard and showing the students where the simile or the metaphor or the personification was. So taking that bit out of it. And that's why it's backwards, because I'm basically telling them, here it is. But more importantly, what I'm focusing on is, why and how, right? What does this literary device accomplish? How does it intensify the mood? Why is it there? Why did the writer put it in there? And I find through that lens and that understanding, students become more comfortable with just understanding what personification or metaphor or whatever literary device is. So in this example here, my literature students would read the poem Out Out by Robert Frost, and we want to look at examples of zoomorphism. So instead of asking my students, find an example of zoomorphism, I would show them where the examples of zoomorphism is. And crucially, I would instead ask, how do these examples of zoomorphism intensify the tone and the mood? What are they doing? Why would the writer put them in there? What is it doing to the poem? How is it making us feel? And I do think this is important because students need to understand the how and the why, right? And I find particularly with literary devices and with kind of understanding writer's purpose, we do kind of do it backwards a little bit. So even though I call this backwards analysis, I think generally the approach to teaching students about literary devices can be a bit backwards. And what I mean is we kind of ask students to treat it like it's like this crystal ball where they're supposed to, divine where these devices are. Or we treat it like this treasure map, like, okay, here's your poem and, find the metaphors. But really what I think we need to be doing is treating it like it's a window. And if we need to make that window smaller and just really focus on, okay, here it is, but can you tell me why this is an important device and what the writer is accomplishing here? I think that is a much more effective strategy and will help long-term with kind of understanding the writer's purpose. Now, if we move on to decoding and sentence completion and trying to figure out, what are some ways that we can help students kind of improve their decoding and sentence completion ability? To be honest, the best and potentially only strategy I can think of is just to create a vocabulary-rich environment. That is, I think, the proven way to do it. Now, you might be asking, okay, that's great, but what are some ways that I can create this vocabulary-rich environment? One example I would recommend is creating a word wall in your room. And this really is just a great way to help students see new words regularly and just to increase the chances of it sinking into their memory. Right? As teachers, it is our responsibility to create that vocabulary-rich environment and try to expose students to as many words as possible. And it can be just as simple as designating an area of your classroom and then simply writing a new word on a piece of paper and sticking it to the wall. And now in terms of the follow-up activities, that's completely up to you and also dependent on the age of your students. But you could start just asking students, hey, does anyone know this word? Does anyone want to try to define it? And then as a class, you can discuss the meaning. You can provide a couple examples of the word in context so they can hear how it sounds in a sentence. You can also ask students to look up synonyms to add as branches to that word as well. And here's a couple examples of what those word walls can look like. This would be more geared at the primary level, and this is one geared more towards the secondary level. I really like this one. I'm assuming in this classroom, it's probably an upper secondary classroom. In particular, the teacher might have been concerned about students when they're describing the tone of the text, maybe not having enough words, not enough vocabulary to adequately describe the tone. So there's some great examples up here. You know, if it's got a positive tone, here's some words you can use. If it's a more neutral tone, kind of depending on context, whether it's positive or negative, here's some great tone words. And then here's some negative tone words as well. And again, it's just having that visually up there. You're exposing students to new words that they might not be using because perhaps they've never seen the word before, they've never heard it in context before. And you know, it's a simple activity, but it makes a world of difference. Similarly, but slightly different, you could have like a word of the day or week or moment. In my class, I did something similar. I didn't really call it word of the moment, but I guess that's probably the closest thing. Just every once in a while, we just kind of focus on a new word and then add it to our wall. And again, by introducing new words, you do have that opportunity to highlight special words, funny words, powerful words. And again, this is just helping to immerse students in just that wonderfulness of our language. And you can add these words to the word wall. And again, depending on your students, you can have many different follow-up activities, including like mini presentations on the word. You could ask students, you know, who wants to present the new word tomorrow? And then you could let students pick a new word that they thought was interesting or different or unique. You can have students design the word posters to put up on the wall for extra credit or completion activities. Again, it's just keeping students immersed in that vocabulary-rich environment. And there's lots of free resources online to support these sort of activities. For example, on vocabularyninja.co.uk, they have a bunch of word of the days ready to go. So you have these ready-made slides for you to use. I don't know if the entire website is free, but definitely these slides were free. So if you're concerned about which words to choose or creating, there's lots of stuff online that's turnkey, ready to go. Possibly my favorite activity, one that I used every year in my classroom, was the word cemetery. And basically, a word cemetery is where words and phrases go to die. And this is this might sound a bit harsh, but actually banishing certain words and encouraging students to use entirely new words is a great strategy, just to again immerse them into new words, to get them acquainted with words that they've never seen before or weren't typically using before. And students actually have a lot of fun with it too, especially at the secondary level. So again, similar to your word wall, you could designate an area of your classroom as the word cemetery. And anytime you're noticing a word that's just chronically overused or just not very inspired, like for example, bad, good, happy, you know, he said, she said, and you know, you want them to use maybe something other than said, like protested, declared. You can announce to the class that, okay, this word has died, it's now dead. Stick it on a little tombstone that you make, it's up on the wall, and now the word's effectively killed. And then together as a class, you can come up with synonyms and alternatives to use instead. This is a great tool. I remember I would have students, you know, during essays in class, they'd put their hand up and say, oh, you know, Miss Emily, can I go back and look at the word cemetery? Like I need another word for bad. You know, I'm describing a character, but I can't think of another word, but I want to say that he's bad, but I need a better word. And then I'd say, yeah, sure, of course. And then they'd go up, they'd look at the gravestone, and they'd choose another word. And again, it's just getting them acquainted with new words, with different words. Here's a couple examples here of, you know, students putting those word cemeteries together. Again, like I've said before, these are not my original ideas. These are tried and true methods. For those of you thinking like, whoa, you know, cemetery is a bit harsh, I don't know if I like that language or that concept, that's fine. I think word hospital could work as well, right? Where words go to recover and triage. Instead of gravestones, you could have hospital beds that you put the word on. And then you could ask students to add those synonyms and alternatives as part of the recovery process. And I think this would possibly be a better alternative for your younger students, or maybe in cases where cemetery or concepts of death might not be, you know, entirely appropriate. They could be too harsh and scary. Either way, it is a very fun way to kind of think about those different words that could be used instead. And then lastly, just in terms of phonics, because as you know, if you're using the NGRT, even though with section 1 is always sentence completion and section 2 is typically comprehension, But for students who initially struggle with the decoding and the sentence completion, instead of going into the Part 2 comprehension, the NGRT will pivot to phonics instead. And if that's the case, and you have students with kind of phonics results and you want to work on improving their reading and literacy outcomes, I do have a couple suggestions here. I will be honest and say that I personally don't have a lot of experience working with kind of teaching phonics. But I will say that there are plenty of great turnkey phonics lessons online, lots of free resources. And also I am a bit hesitant to provide any kind of particular activity because I think with phonics, it is very bespoke and particular to the student, and that you will need to be a bit more responsive to that individual student's needs. However, a few options here. I don't want to give you nothing. So for example, the website Teachers Pay Teachers has affordable options. There are so many like high quality phonics resources on Teachers Pay Teachers. With Teachers Pay Teachers, it does cost a bit of money because these are real life teachers who are designing lessons to be shared with teachers around the world. Although I am aware that a lot of schools will include a Teachers Pay Teachers subscription or like a kind of like a budget they will include in the larger department budget. So that might be something to look into. And also with those free resources, just as an example here, on teachingexpertise.com, I found an article called 25 Fantastic Phonics Activities for Kids. These were geared for quite young kids, but there was a lot of kind of fun built into the activities. They very much like games, and there were a lot of wonderful ideas there. So there are quite a few options online to support that as well. So I do want to say thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. Hopefully I was able to provide you with some practical strategies that you can use in the classroom, and that hopefully as your students continue to take NGRT, you will see evidence of that reading and literacy improvement, particularly for their decoding and their comprehension ability. Just a couple reminders. I've got my email here, emily.whitmore@gl-education.com. You are welcome to email me at any time if you have any questions about these activities or you'd like some more information. I'd be happy to get in touch with you and discuss it further. And just a reminder, we have extensive information, support videos, sample reports, and case studies available on our website at www.gl-education.com. And these case studies in particular, quite a few of them do focus on the NGRT and just the wonderful best practice, NGRT best practice that several schools around the world are sharing. So thank you again.